It's always a privilege to come and share God's word with you. But before we look in the passage in Luke, I just want to read you something from Philippians. I was driving in the car and a passage wouldn't leave me. I don't know if you're a preacher and that ever happens to you. No, God hasn't changed the message, but I think this is for somebody here. And that's from Philippians 4, verses 6 and 7. Very familiar words, but it says, "Be anxious for nothing, but in prayer and supplication with thanksgiving to God, let your requests be known to God." And this was the phrase that came to me particularly. It says, "And let the peace of God, which passes all understanding, guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus." Now, I really felt that was for somebody here. Otherwise, God would have prompted me with me this morning. But it says that little bit about guarding your hearts and minds. And just maybe there's somebody here who doesn't know God's peace in their heart, and God really wants to minister his peace to you this morning. You know, if that's for you, take it and run with it, and may God bless you abundantly as we look at that. Let's turn to this passage from On the Road to Emmaus. When an email came through, I think it came from Andy about speaking, immediately God said to me and gave me this title. As those of you know, I've spoken here, I have rather amusing titles to some of my messages. And God gave me this title. It says, "Who are you?" And let's have a look at the picture of the scene. So here we go. We pick it up in Luke 13. And it says, "Behold, two of them were traveling to the same village called Emmaus, 7 miles from Jerusalem. And they talked together of all the things that had happened." So picture the scene. These two blokes, and they're, in those days, we didn't jump in a car. We might have jumped in the car, mightn't we? You've been to an event. How many of us have been to a Christian event or a Christian camp? What do you talk about on the way home? For us, you tend to pick the week to pieces, don't you? Or is that unique in our car? Children asleep in the back, baggage piled high, the caravans have everything shoved back in, and you're in the car traveling home. And this is exactly what they were doing. These two blokes walking along the road, coming out of Jerusalem. There's all sorts of bits and pieces that have been going on. The one thing we are aware of, and it's probably that it had been Passover in Jerusalem. The crowds have been bigger and better than ever. And yet, they were talking about this one event in Jerusalem that had sort of dominated everything that was going on. And so we find here in verse 15, it says here, "As they were conversed and reasoned, that Jesus drew near and went with them." You see, you're wandering along, they're having a chat, and this bloke joins them, just appears. As some of you know, I've got a couple of dogs, and we go regularly dog walking, and I must admit, nobody just appears out of the woods. Normally, you see dogs first. You see the dogs coming first, or our two turn around and go, come on, and then you realise there's somebody coming towards you. And quite often, number of times we've been, and we just start chatting. And one of the interesting things is, I always think it's quite amusing, everybody in the village who dog walks knows the names of everybody else's dogs. But you don't know the people of the owners of the dogs. If you're a dog owner, you'll understand entirely what that's about. But you see, they started chatting to this bloke who joined them as they were walking along the roads. And I don't know about you, but you see in verse 17, it says the following, "And he said to them, what kind of conversation is it that you have with one another as you walk and are sad?" You see, the disciples had the hope that Jesus was going to do so much more. And they hadn't yet realized the significance of the resurrection. I think they'd hoped probably Jesus was going to drive the Romans out. After all, that would have been good, wouldn't it? The invading force, he was going to drive them out. Maybe even he was going to sort out those high priests who really hadn't sort of got life sorted. And you see, he asked them this leading question to get an understanding of where they're at, or more importantly, for them to get an understanding of where they're at. I always remember that for years, as some of you know, I was teaching. I taught for 38 years. I'm still working in the school, but I'm not teaching anymore. And you see, one of the things was when I started teaching, it was always good practice to pick on somebody and say, what happened last lesson? Or what did we do last lesson? At which point, if everybody knew that this was what was going on, they'd be frantically going through their books. But you see, interesting thing, he got them to recap. He got them to think about what was happening. I think actually quite interesting that this is now a new thing in teaching, that actually you get the pupils to recant what happened last lesson. I'm thinking, yeah, we were doing that 38 years ago. But you see, in verse 18, it picks upon this, and it says here, then one whose name was Cleopas answered and said to him, are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who did not know the things which happened there in these days? As if to say, where have you been? Have you been down a hermit hole? He was going in the same direction, so probably they were assuming that he'd come from Jerusalem and said, are you the only bloke who in the whole area doesn't know what's going on? But you see, one of the important things was that Jesus wanted them to think about who it was. And you see, Cleopas was the one who was named. He wasn't one of the core group, was he? It's the only time this name appears. And the question that I might like to ask you is, who was the other one? Anybody ever thought about that question, or am I the only one who tends to sort of think about these sort of things? So I did a little bit of digging, and everybody seems to think that it probably actually was Luke, because it's not named in the narrative. If it had been Luke writing about it, it would have been Cleopas and John, or Cleopas and so-and-so. But he doesn't. He doesn't name the other person, and therefore, because of the detail in the narrative, I suspect it was Luke. And we find in him in verse 19, and he said to them, what things have been going on, as if he just didn't know. And you see, it then goes on that he gets them to recount what had been going on. And we find in it carries on in verse 19, the things concerning Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and in word before God and all the people, and how the chief priests and the rulers delivered him and condemned him to death and crucified him. And in verse 21, it says the following. It said, but we were hoping it was he who was going to redeem Israel. Do you see what their hope was in? That's why they were so sad. They thought we were going to see some mighty thing happen. They hadn't fully realized what was going on. And it says, indeed, besides all this, today is the third day since these things have happened. And they carry on to say, and it says, certain women. Can you just get the tone in their voice? Sorry, ladies, they get the tone. They sort of certain women, didn't even name who they were, of our company who arrived at the tomb early astonished us. They didn't find his body and came and say they'd also seen a vision of angels and he was alive. And for certain, those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the woman had said, and they did not see. You see, they saw this event. They came up with an explanation that just overflowed from them. But within them, there was that sense of disappointment because they'd hoped for so much more. These guys had been on the fringe of Jesus. Maybe they'd seen the triumphal entry, if you remember the triumphal entry. Wonderful passage. When Jesus came in and hijacked the high priest's procession. If you realize the significance of that, you'll understand how important it was. And Jesus had come, all this sort of stuff was going to happen, but it didn't work out the way they'd hoped. After all, as he says here, the high priests, they crucified him, stuck him in a tomb. The ladies of the group went to anoint the body, as would have been the tradition. And suddenly he's not there. He's gone. It didn't make sense. But you see, then in verse 25, it says the following, and it said, he said to them, O foolish ones and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. And he explains to them, and verse 27 is the understatement of the Bible. When it says, beginning at Moses and all the prophets, he expounded to them all the scriptures and the things concerning himself. We get one verse that encapsulates the whole of the Bible, don't we? A little understatement. I just love it. Luke is full of that quite often when he's actually assuming we know a whole lot. But we get a very short of explanation, which would have been a very, very long conversation. How many of us have ever had teenagers? Right? What have you done at school today? Stuff. But you've been there for 5 hours. You must have done more. Yes, we had lessons. We try to prize out of our teenagers. Mine are 23 and 25. So, but And we still get stuff. What was your day at work like? All right. What did you do? Cut gears. Right, okay, that's about as much as we get from our youngest sometimes. But you see, there was so much more to this. But we just get that little understatement. But then we find in verse 28, and it says, they draw near to the village where they were going, and he indicated that he would have gone further. That was the way it was to be. He didn't want to impose himself on them. He was a good Jew. He knew what had happened. You know, these guys were going in for a meal. They were going into their house. And yet he said, I'm carrying on. But obviously, them being good Jews actually invited him in for a meal. Said, look, you know, we've been walking 7 miles. Is a long way. Probably about half the day they'd been walking for it. The weather was warm. So they said to him, look, just come in with us. Come and have a meal, you know. But you see, that was not the... And then we find in verse 30, it says, and it came to pass as he sat at the table with them, he took the bread, blessed it, broke it, and gave it to them. That was not the usual thing. You know, a guest was to be served, not to serve the people who were there. And you see, he wasn't there to officiate at the meal, yet Jesus took the initiative. And it says here in verse 31, it says, their eyes were opened and they knew him, and he was gone. Can you imagine what that was like for them? You know, this bloke sitting at the table with them, he's handed them out bread. We're going to share communion later on. But he had this, and suddenly he was gone. And we find, and then they said to each other, did our heart not burn with us when he talked with us on the road and while he opened the scriptures to us? How many of us know that when Jesus is doing something in our lives, sometimes we feel that sense of excitement? Sometimes when we've had a really, really busy week, I must admit it's quite nice to go, and I go near where we live, and I take some time out, normally with the dogs, just go and be quiet and just allow God to speak and to minister. And you come back with a sense of excitement, anticipation, whereas you went out with a sort of, oh. This is how these guys were like, wasn't it? They were disappointed. And suddenly, at the result of just somebody breaking some bread, wow, their hearts were enlightened. And then we find in verse 33, it says, so they arose that very hour and returned to Jerusalem. You know, it was probably getting dark as they did the journey. That journey back to Jerusalem from Emmaus, we reckon Emmaus was probably to the southwest. That's where there were quite a lot of people, raiders and all those sorts of people to the south of Jerusalem in those days. You know, it was going to be a risky journey going back. It was getting dark, but they took the risk. They were so excited about what was going to happen. And it says, and they went and found the 11. They knew where to find those who believed with them. And that's important that we need to know where we can go and find God's people. When things get really tough, where do we go to find God's people? And then we find here in verse 34 and 35, and it says, the Lord is risen indeed and has appeared to Simon. It's interesting, they didn't say it's appeared to us. They were recounting what had happened to Simon. And they told them about the things that had happened on the road and how he was known to them in the breaking of bread. You see, Jesus came and met them at a meal. And this morning, as we share communion and we share the things of God, do we need God to come and meet us in a particular way? I could not leave us with that challenge. You see, these disciples, as they were walking along the roads, they knew about Jesus. They'd been on the fringe, so they knew all about Jesus. And suddenly what happens as a result of this walk? They suddenly move from knowing about Jesus to having met with Jesus. They now knew him. So one word had gone from that sentence, from knowing about Jesus to knowing Jesus. And the question is, for those of us here and those online and those watching later on, do we actually know Jesus in the way in which he wants us to know him? And you see, the question was that they were walking closely with Jesus and didn't recognize it. How many times have we done that? You know, we have interesting weeks, and I'll give you the classic one. I had a message from my wife last night. I was in Swindon helping run a meeting in Swindon, and I had this message. She says, there's a bucket full of water under the boiler. We'd had a great week. There's a bucket full of water under the boiler, and she sent me a photograph of the boiler with sort of rusty water running down it into this bucket underneath. But you see, in all of that, doesn't matter what's going on, we can know Jesus. As I got up this morning, I just said, Lord, I just commit this to you. What do you want to happen with this? It's not what I planned. My wife had planned to be here this morning. She's waiting for British Gas. But we got an appointment, not the 22nd of July, which was the other one. But you see, we can know God's provision in that. But you see, far more importantly is where do we walk closely with Jesus? But we can see here that irrespective of what these two guys felt, they were known by Jesus, and he cared enough to join them in their disappointment to walk on the road with them, so that they could have their lives turned round, their lives would be changed. And if it was Luke who was walking with them, we have one of the Gospels as a result of that particular account. So let's just take that away with us this morning, that do we know about Jesus? Do we know Jesus? And if we do, are we walking closely with him in our day-by-day walk? We thank God for his word this morning.